incredible was that musical performance? That was such a special, I felt like it was, just a really wonderful way for us to close one piece of our session and move into the next. I'm Janelle Weissman, Regional Head of External Relations with UN Women in Asia and the Pacific, and it's an absolute pleasure to be here with all of you today. I just want to run through for a moment what this is going to look like over this next little while. So we are going to hear from our dear colleague Gary Ford, who I will introduce in a moment. And we are going to have the opportunity, while he's speaking, to engage in documenting questions. So many of you may be familiar with Slido. I don't see the QR code up just yet, but I believe, it's in the brochure. So if you kindly refer to the brochure, which, this one? Yes? Okay. So please find the Slido QR code, and that will enable you to jot down any questions that you have throughout the session, because the point of this workshop is about you. It's about making sure that we're able to respond to and exchange with and learn from all of you. So this should be as interactive as possible. But Gary will be presenting for around 30 to 32 minutes, and then we will move into the Q&A. But again, this is going to be a very engaging presentation. And then we will all break bread together at the conclusion of the session, so we'll have a chance to enjoy some dinner once we wrap up. But it's, presentation Q&A, and then exercises. As I said earlier, this is about flexing your own muscles around how we can make changes and create more inclusive teams in our own workplaces. So I am going to briefly introduce Gary, and just give me one moment to get to our dear colleague. I'm so sorry. All right, so Gary has more than 30 years' experience leading private sector companies, and he has come to this work recognizing the importance of men really being advocates to advance a gender equality agenda, because it's not just about women. This is about all of us. It's about ensuring that we can create inclusive workplaces and teams to be able to reap better business dividends, literally, to improve company performance, and also to do the right thing so that we can all bring our own selves to work. I'm not going to go into any more detail. You have his detailed biography in the booklet, because without further ado, I'd like to hand over to my colleague and friend, Gary Ford. Gary.
And thank you so much for all of you coming here today. Super excited and deeply honoured to have the opportunity to talk to you all. So as Janelle mentioned, I'm going to talk about building inclusive teams. I'm going to talk about why that matters, why I think it's critical to business success in an increasingly complex world. I'm going to talk a little bit about the challenges we have building inclusive teams, and hopefully share a few ideas about how we can solve those challenges. As Janelle mentions, we will be getting you on your tables to have a little bit of discussion about your thoughts about how we can solve these challenges. I'm also going to, because we are running slightly late, I'm going to kind of skip over a couple of slides, but you will have all the slides available at the end. So just very quickly about me, as it says, I'm a former managing director within global technology at JP Chase, the large US financial services firm. I currently am the managing director and the co-founder of a firm called Men for Inclusion. We specialize in helping executive teams develop inclusive leadership skills. And I also am the co-author of a book, The Accidental Sexist, which is being translated into Korean, you'll be pleased to hear, and should be issued hopefully in January. So, without further ado, I'm going to gloss over this. I was going to talk a little bit more about my background, but I'm going to jump straight to the right-hand side and talk about how I got involved in diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I've described this as being a student of that subject. I haven't been doing it probably as long as many, but it is a fascinating conversation. It's a fascinating area, and I am still learning. Every time I do a conference like this, I will learn something new, and I clearly would like to learn from what you guys think as well. So my journey started in 2015, as I mentioned, Managing Director in Technology at JP Morgan, and I was asked to become the executive sponsor of our Women in Technology program. Technology, the IT industry struggles, like many others, to attract and retain women. In most westernized democracies, it's usually about 20 to 25% is female. JP Morgan wanted to do something about that. And I started finding myself in a room with usually around 50 or 60 women, and I was the only man. That was quite uncomfortable, if I'm honest. But the reason we were there was that we were trying to explore why it is that women don't want to work within technology. And as we were having these conversations and when we started talking about some of the issues that they saw, I began to realize that I was not seeing these challenges at all. The issues, the extra barriers that women were describing to me were frankly invisible to me. And I'm going to tell you about a few of those barriers in a short while. But I also realized if they're invisible to me, they were probably invisible to most of my male colleagues. So we launched a Male Allies program for women in technology, with the express view that we wanted to go out and share the fact that women were having a much poorer experience in the workplace. They were often things that were not deliberate, they were unintentional, but nevertheless where they were creating a barrier for women. And I wanted to ask men what they could do about it. And some of what I learned, talking to now thousands of men and thousands of women on this subject, is what I'm going to share with you today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why this is a really relevant subject in an increasingly complex business world. And one of the first issues is that companies know that they have to attract a new set of talent to their organizations. We, in most westernized democracies, have an aging demographic. Certainly, in most Western countries, the birth rate is declining. I know that's particularly problematic in Korea. And therefore, we know that we cannot rely simply on employing the same kind of set of people that we traditionally did, particularly in what have traditionally been very male-dominated sectors: finance, IT, construction, energy. So the demographics are against us. Companies simply will not be able to find talent unless they find more women, more people from other underrepresented communities. And that demographic change is not just affecting employees and your talent, it's affecting your customers too. Your customer demographic is changing. And who has access to money and payment and funding is beginning to change too. Let me give you an example from the UK. In the year 2000, women owned roughly 5% of private wealth in the UK. By 2030, it's likely to be well in excess of 50%. That's an enormous change in 30 years. So if you're, for example, a wealth management company who advises people that can relate to those women that now own all that private wealth. The second thing is we do have a set of increasingly complex problems to solve, whether that's the green transition to a low-carbon society, whether that's the ethical implementation of artificial intelligence, whether that's migration or immigration crises. No one company, no one country, no one person can solve these problems alone. We have to collaborate at scale. And we also have to find different diverse voices in order to have the level of innovation that we need to be successful as companies in the 21st century. The third challenge we have is that we are beginning to see this huge polarization of opinion driven by the way in which people consume news through social media. Now, there was a really interesting study recently by the Financial Times on the opinions of men and women between the ages of 20 and 29. And they started seeing this significant shift in political opinion between men and women. Men were going politically to the right, women were going politically to the left. The place where this is most marked is South Korea. But it's also true in Germany, in the UK, and the US as well. Now, I'm not advocating whether right-wing policies are good or left-wing policies are good. That's not my point. My point is, I do not think this is healthy. I do not think this is a good thing that men and women are beginning to be divided, because this subject, diversity and inclusion, gender equality, is about all of us. It is good for men, as well as being good for women, and we cannot solve these problems just as women and just as men. We have to solve it together, so this is a problem. The final thing I'd say is the fact that, and I don't know if it's happened yet in Korea, in the UK, we have started to see business failure due to poor, toxic behaviors within leadership. We've had 2 companies fail because that happened. The Confederation of British Industry, the Crispin Odey hedge fund, there are a few other examples, but they failed as businesses because the toxic behaviors of their senior leadership was uncovered and wasn't stood for. So this becomes a long-term sustainability issue for companies if they do not have an inclusive culture. And I think there's a really interesting definition of the word culture. Culture is the worst behavior you are willing to tolerate. So we cannot tolerate these behaviors because they're going to begin to cost your business. And your shareholders care, and particularly your investors care. If you're seeking investment, particularly if you seek an investment in your company internationally, they will care what you're doing on this subject. It is really quite critical. And in the UK, I don't know if it's happened in Korea yet, the regulators, certainly in the financial services industry, are looking really carefully at what people are doing with diversity and inclusion. I'm going to duck over that because it gets even more depressing, and we're going to have to push on for time. So I want to focus on why inclusion is the important part of this conversation. Part of our challenge, when I talked about the polarization challenge, and I think it's particularly marked in Korea, by the way, is that our focus to date on diversity, and particularly on female representation, although it has made amazing strides and it's been a really positive thing, we are now reaching the point where it's beginning to be seen as divisive. And therefore, we need to think about how we move to a conversation that's about inclusion, which is about all of us. And I've defined what the word inclusion means, at least in the English language. I hope this translates well into Korean. The act of making a person or thing part of a group. The policy or practice of making sure that everyone has access to resources and opportunities. This is key. For me, inclusion is about solving that problem. Because our companies are not meritocracies. We like to think they are, but there's all sorts of barriers. And we've heard lots of them today, that there are for women and for others, for underrepresented groups. And we also know that some of those barriers affect men too, probably in subtly different ways, but there are ways in which our current world of work is constructed that create barriers for men too. And I think the key thing, and I've seen this several times, is if you focus just on diversity without inclusion, you are wasting your time. I came across this really interesting thing recently. I went to an energy conference on diversity and inclusion in the UK. Now, the energy sector has a huge challenge with talent. So in the UK, they estimate that they need to hire something like 500,000 people in the next 10 years to support the green transition. And they've realized, unsurprisingly, that they can't all look like me. So they've started all these programs to attract many, many more women and those from other underrepresented groups. And 5 years later, the proportion of women has barely moved. Because they've hired all these women, and then they just left quicker than their male counterparts. Because they focused only on the diversity bit and didn't do anything about the inclusion bit. Because the inclusion bit is creating the right culture for those women to thrive within the company. And this is the key point. Inclusion is the fertile ground in which diversity can flourish. Because if you don't have that, there's no point hiring those people. And if you want, the middle section is all about the great performance, and you've heard all of this today, and I won't labour the point, but better financial performance, better innovation, better levels of employee engagement. None of these things will happen unless you have inclusion. So how do we do that? So one of the critical things that we believe at Men for Inclusion, the company that I now co-run, is that this is a change program. It's arguably the most difficult change program in the history of business. Let's face it, we've been working at this for decades, if not centuries. And progress is being made, but it's actually feeling very incrementally slow. And I think the last presentation, where we saw the statistics around the gender pay gap, shows just how much work we need to do. So this is the thing, we need to treat this as a change program. And like all change programs, and I don't know, would anyone describe themselves as a change management expert in the room? I mean, the first thing with change management, you need to understand who are all your stakeholders, how are they feeling, how do you get them to want to make the change happen? In most companies, your majority group, particularly in senior leadership, are straight, able-bodied men. We need to have a strategy to get them engaged and to get them to want to make change, to build an inclusive culture. And today we're going to go for a couple of these steps, and then we're going to have an exercise about a couple more. But it does start with awareness, but also awareness not at a really macro level. We all know that there are systemic issues that affect women and others for underrepresented groups. We heard about the motherhood penalty, for example, in the last session. But the ones I'm going to share with you are very precise. They're very specific, and actually they're in your handouts. We will get to that in a second. And therefore, there are things that will immediately occur to you that we can start doing something about. We can start fixing them. The second part of it, having made sure that we understand the problem we're solving, is to then create the desire in people to want to solve that problem, and for everyone to want to solve that problem, not just women. Once we've done that, once we've got everyone understands the problem, we've got a bunch of motivated people that really want to solve it, then, to be honest, that doesn't tend to be me telling you how to solve this problem. That's about you, both men and women and many other genders, talking together how to solve this problem in your context. Because it is subtly different. It's subtly different across companies, across sectors, across countries. But the problem's the same. There are many ways you could begin to solve it. And again, we heard some great examples of that. Shared parental leave is a really interesting one. That's a great example of how we can begin to solve these problems. The final part, which we won't include today, but if you'd like to hire me at a later date, that's fine too, is how we can take this conversation out of the classroom. Nothing gets fixed in a classroom or a conference. How can we make it real in people's daily jobs every single day? Here's one of the interesting things about inclusion versus diversity. Most of us cannot change diversity every single day. We are not hiring every single day. We are not promoting every single day. So that's tough. But we can all be inclusive every single day. Inclusion is like a muscle. You need to exercise it. You know, and the more you exercise it, the better you get. Okay. Right. So I'm going to spend a bit of time on awareness now. This is back to the book, The Accidental Sexist. The summary of the book really is the fact that we all are accidentally sexist. Women are, men are, because the way in which we expect the genders to work, the way we expect different genders to have specific skill sets, it's deeply ingrained in our minds from a very young age, and actually constantly reinforced as we go through our lives. So all of us do it. Women do it just as much as men. This is not like men bad, women good. It's not. That's not how it works. But it does create barriers for women. And we've got some data, and again, the data's in the handouts you have, that shows it's about a 15 to 30% that these barriers we create are more likely to happen to women. It's not to say they don't happen to men. They do, just not as much. And it's invisible to most people. It's invisible to me when I was a manager 10 years ago. And therefore, even though we can often be very well-intentioned, we create these barriers. Making sense so far? So let's have a few examples. And as I say, there is handouts on your tables. And actually, there are other examples that we don't have time to go through, but the data's available to you. So the first challenge is, who gets the opportunities? Well, now we tend to believe that women have certain skills connected to being very conscientious, showing great attention to detail, being good people, good relationship people. Clearly true of some women, clearly not true of all women, clearly true of some men too. But unfortunately, what that means, because we have this innate belief, we tend to push women far more towards administrative work, and we therefore tend to leave men to have the far more career-enhancing opportunities. Not deliberately, happens by mistake, but you can see there's a 15%, maybe 20% difference between men and women's experience. This is our research, our data. Secondly, there's lots of interesting research about how performance is evaluated. And in particular, in male-dominated industries, women's competence is often doubted. They have to work harder to prove their competence. I used to see this all the time in technology. Men really doubt women's technical ability because they don't see it so often. And also, women's experience of any promotion processes tends to be much worse. One interesting piece of research is the fact that they found that men are quite often promoted because they have leadership potential. Women are only ever promoted based on past experience. So we make it that little bit harder for women to get promoted. Because actually the research shows that we connect masculinity to leadership. It's kind of quite hardwired in our brains, which is kind of interesting, right? And again, you can see a roughly 20%, more than 20% difference in male-female experience. There's a lot of challenge about who gets heard. And here you see the biggest difference. Do you feel heard in group situations? Do you feel you're more frequently interrupted? And this is like 25-30% difference. Now, this is really interesting, I think, particularly this one about being heard. Because it's clearly critical to business success being heard, right? You want your ideas to be valued. You want to be able to contribute. You got to have other people think your ideas are good ideas, right? But what's interesting here is this problem affects men as well as women. So when you solve this problem about who gets heard, not only do you solve it for nearly 70% of the women in your organization that feel they're not being heard, you solve it for 40% of the men in your organization who feel they're not being heard. That's inclusion. Inclusion is about solving problems that not only affect the underrepresented group, it's also about solving problems that affect everyone. And then the final thing I want to talk about is this idea that we all have affinity biases. We all will gravitate towards people that look like us. I did a workshop for a large insurance company in the UK. There's a whole day thing. We went for lunch at lunchtime. I went to the staff canteen. I looked around the room, and the whole room was divided on gender lines. Table of women, table of men, table of women, table of men. We can't help ourselves. It's what we do. So we make these connections with other people, and that again leads to a difference in that experience. Every single company that I've done some research with will have women, I don't know if this happens, I don't know if this translates in Korean, I'll give it a try, have women who complain about the old boys club or the old boys network, a bunch of men who go out and socialize, and the women never get invited, right? Every company has this. Okay. And the final thing I'd just like to make about this is, and we just had a great presentation about performance management and how you kind of try to de-bias that. One of the interesting things around this is probably most people's kind of employee life cycle when it comes to performance. One of the issues with this is the bias that could be happening in one part of the process that affects a different part of the process. So when you get to the performance evaluation stage, it could be you're evaluating a man's performance against a woman's, and it's quite clear the man's outperformed the woman, right? It's obvious from the data you've got. But the problem was in when you were doing the objective setting and the task and project allocation piece. Because the women got all the admin, and the man got the exciting career opportunity. So these are the things that are happening in your organization, I would strongly imagine. So, what can we do about it? So this is the second bit. This is about how we begin to create a desire. And I go back to my change management theory. We've got to think about where people are on their journey and what their understanding of this, and how do we get them engaged. Now, most of us, if we're honest, are in that passive camp. How many of us go into the world of work every morning and think, how can I be more inclusive? We don't. We're not doing that. But we also know that lots of people have kind of moved into this resisting camp, because this focus on diversity, this focus on female representation has created a bit of a backlash. And people are moving into this. I mean, our research will show there's about 20% of people, it's mostly men, but not all men. Women are worried about the impact of this subject on their sons and on their husbands, on their partners. We think that's about 20%. The data I skipped over earlier says it could be as much as 60% of people are now resisting building inclusive culture. So we need to get them to the right-hand side of this slide, and we need to get them to want to become allies and want to become inclusion leaders. And I'm going to differentiate between those two things. I'd just like to say allyship is an important step. I think lots of women, and hopefully a few in this room, feel that their careers have progressed because there's been a man who's been a passionate ally of them, have really supported them, really kind of helped them with their careers. Allies do good things. It's not enough. Particularly if we're asking allies, or allies basically are trying to simply coach, mentor, sponsor, train, support women and others for underrepresented groups to succeed in the current culture. Are we just simply training our women to just act like our men? It's interesting, lots of women on workshops like this say to me, I'd much rather work for a man than a woman. So are we just coaching our women just to kind of behave like pseudo-men? And what we want people to be is inclusion leaders. And inclusion leaders are supporting, coaching, mentoring, sponsoring, training men and women on how to succeed in an inclusive culture. And a lot of that's turning the mirror in yourself and reflecting on, am I inclusive? and then it's about focusing on the culture. So, time, right, I need to wrap up fairly quickly. So one of the problems we've done, and I go back to men, not all men, some women are in this camp, but go back to our resisting camp, a lot of the work we've done to date has demotivated men from this subject. And that's our problem. And we need to fix that. We've basically made this a subject that's scary for men. It's difficult for them. They are worried that they'll say the wrong thing. They're worried that, actually, some of them don't even know how to talk to women in a professional setting. We've put all this pressure on them to engage. It's interesting, today's Gender Equality Conference, I look around this room, congratulations to the 3 men that have made it, but we put pressure on men to engage with this subject. We've made it difficult for them. We've also maybe communicated to them really poorly. Companies have said, we're going to have 40% women in our senior leadership ranks by the year 2025, full stop. For some people, that's great. That's music to their ears. But there's some people going, what does that mean for me? How does that affect my career? We've also maybe felt that we're somehow blaming men. We've told men it's their fault. We've put them in a room and said, well, you're privileged and you're biased. You're biased. You're aggressive in a micro way or whatever. It's almost like we've got them in the room and told them they're bad people. I don't know about you guys, but that to me is a terrible change management strategy. That's not how we're going to win hearts and minds, by telling people they're bad people. Also, I think men, and perhaps had a lack of role models in this subject. Women can see lots of role models of women who have broken the mold of the gender stereotype stay-at-home mother. You've got 1,001 examples of it. There's many of them in this room today. Where are the role models for men who've broken out of gender stereotypical behaviors? How many men are we celebrating for being stay-at-home fathers, for working flexibly, for taking their full allocation of parental leave? Although I love the story from Lotte earlier on. That was brilliant. But men don't have those role models. And then finally, they are worried that we somehow are reducing their opportunity. So the final thing, and then we'll do a little bit of Q&A, and hopefully people have done some questions on Slido, is to talk about the motivators. We need to make this a positive conversation for men. We've got to find the things that will make them want to become inclusion leaders. And the first thing is maybe helping them understand the benefits to them. And this is based on our research. This hierarchy is done based on our research of men who are engaged in this conversation. And the thing they talk about the most is they've seen it benefit themselves, they've seen it benefit their teams, they've seen it benefit their communities. I always talk about the fact that my motivation for doing this work is a very selfish one. I think it helps me get better at what I do, whatever that may look like. Maybe they're diverse themselves. Maybe it could be neuro, it could be socioeconomic, but actually that's quite a good thing. We are all diverse, every single one of us. We all have some unique characteristic that allows us to think, actually, there are times when I am not getting the advantage, irrespective of other characteristics. We know that seeing the poor experiences of loved ones can make a difference. Women often roll their eyes when men talk about getting involved because they have daughters. I don't care. That's still a good reason to me. If you're going to be motivated by the fact that you can see if the world of work is not great for your children, that's still a great motivator for you to do the work. And then finally, I do think this sense of fair play is actually quite a strong motivator. I think when you show to people that this is not meritocracy, some part of your organization is not getting a fair crack, I actually think most people go, well, actually, that's not fair. So this is the key. How can we create a narrative, not just for men, for everyone that's doubting the need for inclusive culture? Because it is a business imperative. We've got to find a way of doing this. So we've got to find ways that will work for everyone. I'm not going to go over this slide, because Sohi's going to hook me off with a crook if I'm not careful. But there's a number of great conversations that you can create with your team, with your colleagues, about why this is good for them as individuals. And that can range from their own personal development to their health and well-being, to the opportunities and choice it gives them, through to the fact that, do they want to leave a legacy? Do they want to leave work a better place than they found it? So in a minute, we are going to do a bit of an exercise. But before we do that, I think we're going to do some Q&A. And then you're going to do some work, if that's okay.
네, 저희 Q&A 시작하기 전에
So before we get started with the Q&A session, I would like to give you some announcements. Please use the interpretation devices if you need to. You may also ask your questions in Korean. First of all, we are going to receive your questions on the slide. So on your booklet, there is a QR code on the bottom, so you can take a look at the workshop too. And that is where you can access and ask questions. So if you pop up with any further questions after the session, you can also ask your questions on the floor. So English and Korean will both be available. So don't be shy because you will have to use the Korean version. Both language will be all available. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So, and I apologize for not announcing earlier. So absolutely, I do want to check before I kick it off if there's anybody with a question that they would like to initiate for the session with Gary. There will still be time for Slido and also from the floor. But please do not hesitate, raise your hand. If I'm not seeing you, feel free to stand up. Feel free to make sure that I see you and I hear you. We want to hear from you. So, forgive me, as so he has very thoughtfully translated the questions received in Korean so that I can look at them in English. So I'm just scrolling through. I think this is a really useful one, Gary, because we've talked in some of the big, and we've had limited time. So we've talked in some broad terms around the importance of inclusion. You can't have a diverse workplace that will flourish unless you have inclusion. There's a question around size of organization. So if you're small, what are the very first steps that you can take to engage men and implement DE&I? Love to hear examples of the baby steps taken. So thinking about small-sized organizations, I think oftentimes we hear about the biggies, the multinationals. We're exchanging across oceans when there's a great practice in Korea, like Lotte's practice. We share that with other parts of the world. But when you're small, some ideas?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I do think it's a very different problem, actually. And actually, small companies have, I think, quite a natural advantage with this subject. And one of the things if I ever have the privilege of leading teams, one of the first things I like to do with those teams, and I think this works quite well at a small company level, is create what we call a culture contract. I don't know if anyone's ever tried doing this, but the idea actually that you sit down with everyone on the team and get their view on the things that matter to you as a team, the things that are important to you as an individual, as a person. And that can be the small stuff like, we try to always turn up to meetings on time, simple stuff like that. We always say hello to each other in the mornings. We make an effort to get to know the other people in the organization, the people that we don't know so well. That we want to socialize as a team, but we want to be able to do that in a variety of different ways so everyone can always attend. So I think creating your own little view about how the culture needs to work for you and getting everyone involved in that conversation is quite key. Because, I mean, the point of this whole conversation, and I think maybe slightly differing to some of the earlier conversations, all of this stuff, I think, starts with you as individuals. This is not about what your company policy says. It's not about creating new procedures. I think it's about small incremental things that you do each and every day. So that's where I'd start, this idea of, let's define our culture about how we want to operate as a team.
Super, thank you so much. All right, we're getting them in real time. So again, forgive me as I scroll through. I'd love to ask you this one.
Okay.
You're like, thanks, Janelle. I wonder what that's going to be. What was your motivation to do work in inclusion?
Yeah, you know what? It's funny actually. I think I'd started out being quite horrified when I realised that there was kind of this different lived experience, and it was just that sort of sense of fair play almost. I think that was the starting point. And actually, you know what? I've seen this quite a lot, actually. I come from a relatively, in UK terms, lowly socioeconomic class. So in the UK, that's kind of working class. So I grew up on a council estate, single-parent family. So I do think I find people from that background are often quite motivated by a sense of fair play. I've seen it with actually executive leadership teams as well. So that was my starting point. But I think I was saying earlier, after a little while, I began to realize that this was helping me get better at what I did as a day job, right? I felt that I was beginning to actually build better relationships with the people that work for me. I also began to see that I was seeking out more diverse opinions. I joined our reverse mentoring scheme, for example. So I was being mentored by a woman right at the start of her career who thought about my problems very differently to me. And that was actually super helpful. So I began to realize this was actually helping me do my job better. And actually, I began to kind of try and work a lot harder at all sorts of things outside the home, with my wife, with my daughters, with my friends. My friends were all like me. They were kind of like on the neurodiverse spectrum, never spoke about their emotions, never spoke about anything important, always wanted to just speak about sport and music and that kind of stuff. So actually I started finding I could interact with them a little bit better. So I began to realize this is about personal growth for me. And then the final thing that's really made this my kind of life's project is I started talking about this subject in public places like this. And when I came here last year, I talked about this. My daughter was in the audience. And actually the fact that my children like what I do, respect what I do, that's a really nice feeling. When I was working in technology, my daughters were like, Dad, I don't care what you do, right? But now they care. Now they're proud of me. That's a big motivator. And hey, I don't always get it right, as my daughters will tell you, but I'm trying.
It's actually, that's a nice segue. So there's another question received, which is really about calling things out. And I think we all need to be humble and vulnerable and recognize I make mistakes every day, multiple times every day. We all do. So this question is regarding accidental sexism. So something you might hear someone say, you're pretty sure they're not bad intentioned, but it's accidental sexism by a good leader in your workplace. How can a woman employee react to this? And I'll invite as well, how can a man employee react to this? And is it different? Thanks.
I was thinking you were about to take that question yourself. But that's fine. So it's interesting. One of the things that our research discovered, both for the book and subsequently, and this is kind of slightly disappointing, is this fact that when women do call out an issue, when they do make a point of it, they're usually either dismissed or ignored or insulted. When we asked men, when they called it out, what happened to them, it was far less likely to happen to them. So I think it's really interesting for the men in the room, and unfortunately for the women in the room, men will listen to other men on this subject more than they will listen to women. So I think as a man, we've got extra influence, if you like, when we call it out, that actually tends to have a little bit more impact. So I feel that men have a real purpose to doing it. I think for women, it depends on the culture of the organization. I do think it's an extra challenge because they are worried that they'll be seen as the woman that always complains, right? So I do get that. One of the things I think there's two things that are worth considering. The first is, if you're not comfortable calling it out, to think about, is there someone I know who can have that conversation? So kind of use a peer, maybe a male peer perhaps. Is there someone who I can leverage to help with that? But secondly, also this idea that sooner or later you have to maybe try and step in, particularly if it's something that's happening repeatedly. And this will sound crazy, but we advise people to actually practice intervening, practice calling out. And we often run workshops on this, right? Because actually it's not easy. I mean, I don't find it easier any more than you, particularly if it's someone super senior, right? So you have to think about what language maybe works for me. If humor comes naturally to you, actually humor can be quite a good way to kind of diffuse the situation. But sometimes it being useful just sitting down with a close colleague, a peer, and saying, if I did this, would that work? What's your feedback? If someone's constantly interrupting me, if I just say to you, excuse me, can I just finish my point? Or whatever language you might want to use, it's good maybe just to practice doing it. Because it's one of those things, the more you practice it, the kind of better you do at it. So I know it's not easy, but I think you've got to start and try somewhere. Try in a safe space, like everything.
Fantastic. We have audience questions. Do we have a microphone that we can use, or I'll happily share mine? Either. Thank you, Sohee, right in the front.
Hi, we said hi already, and thanks for the session. Just wanted to bring up a quick question. While the DEI agenda is rising as a key corporate buzzword and strategy direction, I think a lot of people cast, I'd say, some suspicious glance upon the terminology about the concepts, because they suspect that just like the term ESG, this might be a temporary thing that swishes through the market and phases out at some point. So to these skeptics, any words of wisdom or any insight you'd like to suggest in response?
Yeah, it's interesting actually. I'm sure you've got an opinion on this as well. I am seeing companies change their language. I am seeing companies not using the D&I term, actually. They're still trying to do the work. They're just using some different labels, perhaps. So whether you call that, I don't know, continuous culture improvement or whatever it might be. So I think language matters. And actually, if we feel that this particular set of language is preventing people from getting engaged, then I'm good with changing it. I'm not convinced it has to be that way. But actually, the central point of it, equity of opportunity, which I think for me is the central point of all of this, that is not going to go away. That is, number one, it's a business imperative. And number two, at the heart of this is a business performance challenge. If people don't feel that they are getting equity of opportunity, it affects, ultimately, over time, it will affect their level of motivation, their desire to stay with the organization, their levels of motivation, how much discretionary effort they will put in. It will affect all of those things. And eventually they'll leave, right? And if you lose a talented employee, that's expensive, first of all, because you've invested all this great knowledge in them. And secondly, it's expensive to replace them, hire someone new. So I do understand the point you're making. I think we may end up moving on from the language. I'm not wedded to it. But I think the business imperative of having an inclusive culture, that's not going away. Business have to do this, is my view.
Thanks for your question. I'm not going to try to answer. We have 5 minutes left, and I want to make sure as many questions get answered as possible. Is anybody else from the audience? Otherwise, I'll have a look at my Slido list. Okay. So this is really interesting, and I pointed to some of the research you were talking about in terms of divides around young men and young women and increasing polarization. You may recognize from my accent, I'm originally from the United States, so talking about a place where there's a lot of polarization on a whole range of issues, it's very familiar territory for me personally. So recently, in the Republic of Korea, generational conflicts between millennial and Gen Z employees and existing employees have intensified. These conflicts are spreading into gender issues. How can we create diversity and inclusion in this context? Any top tips?
Yeah, I think, there's some really interesting work happening actually in the US, I think, in this space. There's a guy called Richard Reeves who's set up an organization called Of Boys and Men. And I think we have to recognize that despite there still being so much work to do to help women and girls thrive, we cannot do that at the expense of boys and men. This cannot be that zero sum. And therefore, I think we have to recognize that there are certain things that are barriers that are specific to men as a gender. We are seeing in most westernized democracies, girls outperform boys in pretty much every level of education. There are some real interesting reasons behind why that is true. I won't have time to go into that. We also know that there are certain health outcomes that affect men more than they affect women. If you take cancer, for example, there typically are far more proactive interventions for women for a range of cancers. There are much fewer for men. And we also know that male suicide rates are very high in most westernized democracies. I don't know about Korea. In the UK, suicide is the biggest killer of men between the ages of 19 and 55. So I think we have to recognize that there are systemic issues that affect men, and I think some of the pushback we are seeing from boys and young men on this subject is due to the fact that I think they are struggling too, and they feel we are not listening. And they are therefore being drawn to certain other cultural influences about what a man should be in the 21st century. And I don't know about anyone else in this room, but I am really uncomfortable with that. And I think we have to provide them with different narratives and listen to their concerns and try to find solutions for their concerns too. I was going to use this earlier. Richard Reeves says, we can do two things at once. We can elevate women and girls, and we can also elevate men and boys. We can do both of those things at once. So I think it starts with some open conversations, a little bit more listening. I think my experience is that when it comes to the workplace, men and women want pretty much the same things. All the research shows that. And therefore, the problems that affect men and women are often the same, and where they're different, we've got to help find solutions. And that's the thing. I don't think this is a question that women find solutions for women and men find solutions for men. That's not the answer in my head. This is men and women finding solutions for both men and women.
Super, thank you so much. I think that's a good note to end on. And I just wanted to flag, and it's not ending because we're going to hand over to you. But I did want to acknowledge UN Women Center of Excellence for the Republic of Korea has translated into Korean Emma Watson's speech on the floor of the General Assembly, which is almost 10 years to the day. Globally, we're marking the 10th anniversary of the He for She initiative. it's incredibly important that we are taking the opportunity to listen to and pay attention to the concerns of men and women and all of us if we want to really deliver change. It's not a zero-sum game, that's for sure. So check it out on Naver. You can find Emma Watson's speech in Korean in full in translation, thanks to our colleagues here at the Center of Excellence. So now we're going to move into the workshop section. Yes. And just to give a quick time check, because there's some agreements that were made in the background. So we have about 20 minutes for exercise. So over to you, Gary.
Yep. So I'm hoping we need to just move the... Thank you. Is this the right one? Yes. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to have a quick table conversation, and I've posed a question for you. And I think the way we do this, can we do this 3 tables take question number 1, and these 4 tables, take question number 2, and just have a discussion. Elect a spokesperson. We'll give you 8 minutes. And the first one is accidental sexism happening in your organization or in other organizations you know? If so, in what ways? And then the second question is, after today's presentation, what strikes you the most? What 1 or 2 manifestations of negative culture in companies that you believe really require change, and why? And I'm looking for the spokesperson to come up with 2 brilliant points, because we don't have lots of time, that came out of your discussion. Everyone good with this? And we'll give you 8 minutes to have that conversation. Okay. 8 minutes is quick, isn't it? You only just got started, I'm sure. Okay. So hopefully you've nominated someone. We were just debating the best way to choose, because we don't have time for every table. So is there a spokesperson, a table that would really like to tell us the 2 key brilliant points from their discussion? Anyone like to volunteer, or do I just choose a table?
And of course, in the language of your choice, so don't let that be a concern.
Yes, good point.
Yes. So, okay, I see a hand in the way back. Fantastic. Sohee, we have a hand in the way back. Yes, please. Oh, thank you so much.
Well, first of all, thank you for this opportunity. We really had a diverse conversation because we had people from working in a domestic big company and also people working in foreign companies. So we could also understand how the different, even in the same country, the cultural context is very different. And I think the conclusion I can make is the most important thing about DEI is that we create an environment that we can freely discuss about it. That is the main issue. In the foreign companies in Korea, they give more opportunities for employees to share about how they feel about their day-to-day life, whereas the big companies, the domestic companies, they tend to just not to openly share and just, play good and then be polite, something like that. So that's our table's conclusion, if I'm not wrong.
Thank you, by the way. and it is such an interesting point. I think this is one of my big pieces of learning with this subject is there is so much value in conversation that does not have to be about action. This idea that sometimes conversation is about just understanding how others think is actually really quite... And actually, it doesn't sound like there's business value to that, but what I found is that there's a lot of business value for opening up conversations that enable you to understand your work colleague a little bit better, because you begin to maybe find some additional skills and knowledge and stuff that can bring... But it doesn't always have to be kind of very transactional, right? It's like about the next project or the next client or whatever it might be. So I think the importance of dialogue is clearly underrated, and I think I do think, I don't know, is it within your control to change that in your Korean organizations? Can you decide for yourself that we want to have more of these type of open conversations? Do you feel people are empowered or autonomous to be able to do that? No, okay. Okay, maybe we need to advocate for more of that. Do you know,
No, I think that's great. I will keep my editorial to a minimum.
Okay.
Who is next?
한국어로
Can we hear?
I would like to make presentation in Korean. So we had a lot of discussion, so it was not easy to pick just 1 or 2 points. So let me just present what we discussed. So among our discussion, let me share the points that struck us the most. It was the name of the book, Accidental Sexism. Nobody has a bad intention itself, but as a conclusion, the environment was always there. That was a very impressive point. And the next part that we discussed about was, well, when we were having these kind of discussions, I was standing as a point of a majority, taking a look at the minority. So whenever it comes to gender equality, we have a stance of males, but at all times, we cannot always be the majority, nor can we always be the minority. So at some point, if we do understand what it becomes to become a minority, it's not an issue of others, it's not an issue of me, it's just an issue of all of us. That's what we talked about.
Again, it's such a great point. And one of the other things I think with this subject is that the way in which we divide can be across some quite strange things. It can be who went to which school or which university. It can be we create divides based on who worked for which previous company or who lives in a particular part of the city or that went to a particular university. We create these divisions along some very different lines. And I think one of the jobs of an inclusion leader is to spot when that happens, actually to realize that that's happening and therefore find the opportunity to actually bring people into those conversations when they are kind of getting left out. So I think I really like the point you made. And then the second point, which I think is what you were saying, is that I do love this idea of walking in other shoes. This idea of trying to see the world from someone else's perspective. And I think it's a really interesting point that it's clear that men have benefited from the current system more than women. I think we have to recognize that. But that's not to say that men don't deserve our empathy either. And I think one of the things I ended up having a conversation with recently at a workshop was about a boss I had, a manager I had, that clearly had a real problem with me. We didn't get on at all. So eventually, I began to think about, so why is my manager so harsh with me? What's happening in his life, in his career, that means he's not treating me as I'd like to be treated? And I actually eventually had a conversation with him a little bit more about his life, his personal experiences, and began to realize what it was that was causing him to be so concerned about the work I was doing. So it took me a little bit of empathy of his experience, even though he was my boss, but he had his own personal challenges, his own challenges both from his career and I think to some extent his home life. And after that, actually, we began to get on much better as a kind of partnership. So I think this point of understanding other perspectives is a really good one. Are we going to wrap up, do we think? 5 minutes. Okay, all right. So I did say we would get on to some action. There is another exercise, so you can take a photo of the exercise and do it later on during networking, up to you. But I wanted to leave you with some specific things that I want you to do, and it is printed on a handout on your tables. These are 5 specific actions that I want you all to take. This is how we're going to wrap up today. They are both in English and in Korean. So the first thing I want you to do is go, assuming you go into the office tomorrow, or whenever you next go, I want you to sit down with your team and tell them about coming to this conference. I want you to tell them what you've learned, the things that were insights to you, and the things that you are going to change to try and become a more inclusive colleague. Okay? That's the first thing. The second thing I'm going to ask you to do, this is a challenging one, I'm going to ask you to be vulnerable. And I'd like you to basically go into your office tomorrow, or next time you have an opportunity, sit down with your team and tell them that you are okay, you are fine, if they call you out. Okay? So, just to give you a little bit more understanding of this, I want you to say to them, I want to be an inclusive colleague, but sometimes I will get it wrong. And when I do, you have my express permission to tell me I have got it wrong. You don't have to do it in a big, large group where it becomes very embarrassing. You can have a quiet word with me afterwards, or you can drop me a quick email. And when you do, I won't get defensive and say, oh, that's just me being me, or I was only joking. I will give it the respect it deserves, and I will promise to do better next time. Back to the point we just had from the table, we all make accidental sexist mistakes. We all need to learn from it. And by telling other people that you're prepared to learn, hopefully they will feel more comfortable doing that. And we talked about the difficulty of calling stuff out, but if you give people permission, they might be a little bit more comfortable, particularly if you have influence, if you're a manager. The third thing is I want you to look around your team when you go into the office tomorrow and look at who is the person you know the least. Who is the person that's most different to you in that team? And I want you to go and find out more about them. I want you to go and find out about their lived experience, which is hopefully a little bit different to yours, and you're going to spend time understanding that. And hopefully sharing yours too. Okay? What's the next one? The next thing is I want you to make inclusive group situations the norm. If you have the opportunity to chair a meeting, I want you to do this right at the start of that meeting. I want you to say, because you're the chair, we are going to run this meeting inclusively. We're going to try not to interrupt each other. We're going to try to make sure everybody is heard. We will make sure everyone has the opportunities to contribute. And we would deal with each other respectfully. There may be conflict. Conflict's okay. But we would do it politely and respectfully. And when we don't meet that standard, we will politely tell each other that we haven't met that standard. And again, just resetting the fact that we are trying to be inclusive. You don't have to do this for every meeting, by the way. But at least every so often in your meetings, just remind people that this is how we want to operate. We want to operate inclusively. And then the final thing is carry on learning. UN Women have got the most fabulous resources available to you to carry on learning on this subject. We talked a lot about gender today, but if you look at sexuality, we look at race, we look at neurodiversity, we look at disability, look at socioeconomic, we could look at age. There is so much to learn. You have to prioritize your learning on this subject. So my final ask is go out and find a book, not my book, there's lots of other great books, a podcast, a research, a TED Talk, a video, whatever your preferred medium, and learn more about this. I know of one particular book that I know has been translated into Korean that I would heartily recommend. If you haven't read it before, read Invisible Women by Carolyn Criado Perez about the gender data gap. It's absolutely essential, particularly for the men, absolutely essential you read this book, but carry on learning. So I think our time is up. Thank you so much for being such an attentive audience. Thank you so much for participating and being part of the great conversation. And thank you so much for being part of trying to change the world for the better.
Absolutely. And if you can please join me, colleagues, as well, in thanking Gary for his contributions today. Thank you so very much, Gary, for talking us through this workshop. Thank you to you all for sharing your own experiences and stories. And this is the conclusion of the second annual Seoul Gender Equality Dialogue. So delighted to be here with all of you. Thank you for taking the time to be a part of this dialogue. Thank you to UN Women's Center of Excellence for Gender Equality. Thank you to the Ministry of Gender Equality and Family for supporting this effort. And we are concluding the proceedings, which means our online participants, this is also the end of your session for the day. Thank you so very much. Please do join us for dinner.
네, 저희 이것으로 워크숍.
This is the end of the workshop. Thank you for your participation and thank you for your